There are names in history that thunder through time, and then there are those that whisper, echoing quietly through the centuries. Karl Marx was both, a dreamer wrapped in fire, and a thinker burdened by the weight of his own vision. He saw a world divided, a humanity chained to greed, and he dared to imagine something different, something fair, something shared. Yet in chasing that dream, he would live a life of endless hunger, exile, and sorrow. This is not the story of a revolutionary written in stone. It is a story of a man, tired, passionate, misunderstood, whose words would one day shake empires. So tonight, as the world slows and the darkness folds around your quiet room, let us drift into the life of Karl Marx, the tragic genius who changed the world forever. If these words carry you closer to sleep, let this channel stay by your side too. Here, history is not loud. It's a whisper, a lullaby for the restless mind. So rest your thoughts and let the story begin. The year was 1818, and the old town of Trier lay wrapped in the soft mist of the Moselle River. It was a quiet place, with cobbled streets and church bells that echoed gently across the hills. Inside a modest stone house on Bruckenstrasse, a child was born, a child who would one day try to rewrite the destiny of the world. His name was Karl Marx. He entered the world at a moment of great contradiction. Europe had just begun to wake from the long shadow of Napoleon, yet it was still ruled by kings and clerics, by wealth and hierarchy. Outside, the factories of the Industrial Revolution were breathing smoke into the sky, and deep beneath that smoke, the cries of the poor were beginning to stir. But in the Marx household, the air was filled with books, shelves heavy with philosophy, literature, and law. The quiet symphony of ideas that surrounded young Karl like lullabies. His father, Heinrich, a lawyer of reason and reform, believed in Enlightenment ideals, in freedom, progress, and the power of human thought. His mother, Henriette, carried warmth and patience, though her life would often be shadowed by her son's restless mind. As a boy, Karl was curious, almost unbearably so. He devoured every page he could find, his eyes moving faster than his hands could turn the paper. He was not content to read about the world. He wanted to understand its hidden pulse. He would ask questions that made adults pause. Why do some suffer while others rule? Why must the strong always feed on the weak? In the quiet corners of his family library, the seeds of revolution began to breathe. By the time he entered the University of Bonn, Karl was already caught between two worlds, the calm order of scholarship and the storm of rebellion beginning to hum across Europe. Students filled taverns with laughter and ideas, their minds alive with poetry and protest. Marx joined them, bold, passionate, sometimes reckless. He drank deeply, argued fiercely, and began to sense that ideas were not just words on paper. They were sparks waiting to ignite. Soon, his brilliance became impossible to ignore. His professors saw in him the makings of a philosopher, though one with too much fire in his heart. He left Bonn for Berlin, where the air was thick with intellectual electricity. There, among the corridors of the university, he met the writings of Hegel, the philosopher who believed history moved through struggle, that progress was born from contradiction. Hegel's ideas would haunt Marx for life. He found in them a mirror and a challenge. If the world truly evolved through conflict, then what a conflict between rich and poor, between those who owned and those who labored? Could it be that the very structure of society was built upon injustice, and that the only way forward was through revolution? Night after night, Marx sat beneath the flicker of candlelight, his eyes half burned by exhaustion, his notebooks filled with restless thought. He wrote with the urgency of someone who felt history breathing down his neck. In his journals, he began to sketch the outlines of a world transformed, not by kings or gods, but by the workers themselves. And yet, behind all his brilliance, there was something quietly human, a loneliness, a yearning. He wanted not only to explain the world, but to heal it. Outside his window, the carriages clattered through the cobblestone streets, carrying men of wealth and power. Inside, Marx sat in silence, a young scholar with ink-stained fingers and an unquiet soul. He did not yet know that his words would one day divide nations and define centuries. All he knew was that the world was wrong, and that he must find a way to make it right. He once wrote in a letter to his father, "The world seems to me like a stage of endless masks, each concealing a deeper truth. It was both confession and prophecy. For behind those masks, he would spend his life searching for what he called the real face of humanity. But in 1841, when he finally earned his doctorate, Marx discovered that the world did not welcome such questions. The university saw him as too radical. The newspapers refused his words. Prussia had little patience for those who spoke of freedom and equality. The same passion that made him brilliant now made him dangerous. Still, his fire refused to dim. He met a woman named Jenny von Westphalen, the daughter of a nobleman, educated, luminous, and as idealistic as he was. Against the expectations of her family, she chose him. The poor philosopher with wild eyes and no clear future. Their love would become his greatest solace and his deepest sorrow. Together, they dreamed of a better world, one built on reason and justice. Yet neither of them could imagine the cost that dream would demand. And so, as the lamps of Berlin flickered into the cold night, Karl Marx packed his books, kissed Jenny's hand, and set his eyes west, toward Paris, toward exile, and toward destiny. Outside, the wind swept through the narrow streets, carrying with it the faint scent of ink and revolution. Inside his coat, close to his heart, he carried his first manuscript, a handful of pages that spoke of freedom, of labor, of humanity. He did not yet know it. But the fire that began in that library would soon set the world alight. Paris, 1843. The city pulsed like a living heart, full of smoke, noise, and restless dreams. Here, in the narrow streets and crowded cafes, ideas walked as freely as men. The poets argued with the philosophers, the exiles with the idealists. Every cafe table was a battlefield of words. Every evening an orchestra of rebellion. Karl Marx arrived with little money, a few books, and a heart swollen with conviction. Paris was everything Berlin was not, alive, unrestrained, burning with possibility. It was a city of contradictions, where the rich dined beneath chandeliers while the poor slept under bridges. To Marx, it was a perfect classroom. He spent his days wandering the boulevards, watching the carriages of nobility pass beggars crouched on the curb. He listened to the voices of the workers, the shoemakers, the printers, the women who washed clothes in the Seine. He wrote their stories in his notebook, not as pity, but as proof. Proof that history was made not by kings, but by the hands that built their palaces. By night, he gathered with other exiles, thinkers, dreamers, rebels, in dimly lit rooms thick with pipe smoke. They spoke of freedom, of justice, of a world reborn. But it was here that Marx's thought began to sharpen, to cut through the haze of idealism that surrounded him. He saw that dreams meant nothing without structure, without theory, without the courage to confront power itself. And then one evening, in a cafe on Rue Vanneau, he met Friedrich Engels. Engels was younger, handsome, confident, and already fluent in the language of revolution. He came from wealth but carried guilt in his heart. Guilt for the workers he had seen suffer in his father's textile factories. He had witnessed firsthand what Marx had only written, the grinding machinery of capitalism and human souls it devoured. Their meeting was like the collision of two storms. They talked until the candles melted into pools of wax, their ideas intertwined. Engels with his practical insight, Marx with his furious intellect, and together they began to shape a vision that would echo across centuries. They spoke of history as a living organism, a struggle between those who owned and those who labored, between oppression and awakening. The world, they decided, would not change through charity or prayer, but through understanding. To change the world, one must first reveal its invisible machinery. Marx's nights grew longer. His small apartment became a fortress of thought. Jenny, his wife, stayed beside him, translating his scribbled notes, cooking what little food they could afford, rocking their child to sleep as Karl muttered himself over papers and ink. Poverty had become their constant companion. The fire that burned his mind gave no warmth to his family. But still, he wrote, he began to draft a work that would soon make him infamous, the Communist Manifesto. It was not a book of destruction, as many believed later, but of awakening. It spoke not to governments or elites, but to the working souls of the world, the ones who toil without reward, who built nations but own nothing. Workers of the world, unite, he wrote. You have nothing to lose but your chains. The words were thunder wrapped in poetry. They were born not from hatred, but from love, love for the forgotten, for the unseen. Yet love alone could not save him. The French authorities soon noticed the restless German writer stirring too many minds. His writings, they said, were dangerous. Not because they called for violence, but because they revealed the truth too clearly. Truth, in the wrong hands, is always a threat to power. By 1845, Marx was expelled from Paris. He packed his meager belongings once more, the same books, the same fire, and moved to Brussels. Exile had become his address, and defiance his home. In Brussels, the work continued. The manifesto took its final shape, each page written with the urgency of a man running out of time. Engels stood beside him like a brother. Jenny typed, corrected, encouraged. The three of them, bound by hunger, hope, and the quiet faith that ideas could outlive them, worked through sleepless nights. When the Communist Manifesto was finally published in 1848, it was a whisper at first, then a spark. Across Europe, revolutions were already stirring. The people were rising, banners unfurled, streets alive with the roar of change. Marx watched with trembling hands. He had not simply written history, he had awakened it. But revolutions, like storms, burn bright and fade fast. Within months, the uprisings were crushed. The kings returned to their thrones. The dream, once vivid, turned to ashes. Marx was hunted again. The governments of Europe branded him a threat, a ghost to be banished. He fled to London with Jenny and their children, leaving behind everything, friends, possessions, even hope, except the one thing no power could strip from him, his conviction. As they crossed the channel, the waves rocked their small vessel beneath the gray sky. Jenny held their infant close, her face pale, her heart steady. Karl stood beside her, silent, eyes lost in the horizon. He whispered to her softly, "One day, my love, the world will understand." She smiled faintly, though both of them knew that the world rarely rewards those who dream too loudly. London awaited them, cold, indifferent, but patient. It would become both his grave and his proving ground. And so, as the night deepened and the smoke of Paris faded behind him, Karl Marx carried with him a new fire. No longer the youthful flame of curiosity, but the steady, enduring glow of purpose. It was this fire, not gold nor comfort, that would sustain him for the rest of his life. London, 1849. The city loomed like a gray ocean, endless, heavy, and cold. Its streets were rivers of smoke and soot, its air thick with the scent of coal and sweat. For Karl Marx and his family, London was both refuge and prison. It was a place where they would find safety from exile and sink into the deepest poverty they had ever known. They settled in a cramped two-room apartment on Dean Street, in the heart of Soho. The walls were damp, the floorboards thin, and the air so cold in winter that Jenny would wrap their children in blankets just to keep their fingers from stiffening. Rats scurried in the walls. Hunger was a familiar sound. Yet in that little room, ideas continued to bloom like stubborn flowers in the dark. Marx worked at a small wooden desk, buried beneath piles of papers and unpaid bills. He spent his days writing articles for European newspapers, earning just enough to buy bread. Each coin was measured carefully. Ink or food, candles or medicine. Often he chose the ink. His friend Friedrich Engels, now managing his father's factory in Manchester, sent money whenever he could. His letters were filled with encouragement, with warmth, and sometimes with guilt. Engels lived among the wealthy, but his heart remained with Marx, the man who had given him purpose, who had shown the meaning behind every laborer's callous hands. Despite the misery, Marx's mind never rested. London fascinated him. The city was a living portrait of capitalism, wealth and despair side by side. He wandered through its foggy alleys and crowded markets, watching the faces of the workers as they trudged to the mills at dawn. He saw children bent beneath the weight of factory labor, mothers pale with exhaustion, and merchants shouting prices like hymns to a new god, profit. And so in the silence of the night, he began his most ambitious work, Das Kapital. This would not be a manifesto of slogans, but a map of the invisible world, the hidden machinery that turned human lives into currency. He sought to uncover how labor became a commodity, how the sweat of the poor built the comfort of the rich. Each sentence was forged from exhaustion and conviction. Jenny would often find him awake at dawn, still writing. The candle burned down to wax and smoke. His hair was wild, his eyes hollow, yet his voice, when he spoke, carried a strange calm. "It must be written," he would say softly. "It must be understood. But history, for all its grandeur, offers no mercy to those who write it. Tragedy struck their small home again and again. 3 of their children died before reaching adulthood. Hunger, illness, the slow cruelty of deprivation. Each loss tore through Jenny's spirit, though she never let Karl see her despair. She knew his guilt was already unbearable. One winter evening, after burying their little boy, Karl returned home and sat in silence. His hands trembled, his eyes fixed on the floor. The fire in the hearth had gone out. Jenny placed her hand over his, whispering, "You must not let the darkness win." He looked at her, tears breaking through the tiredness. "The world must change, Jenny, or all this suffering means nothing." Her eyes softened. "Then write, Karl. Write until the truth can no longer be ignored." And so he did. In those years, he became a ghost among the living, unseen, uncelebrated, but fiercely alive inside. Das Kapital consumed him. He walked the streets of London with a notebook tucked under his arm, scribbling down observations of markets and factories. He visited the British Museum daily, losing himself in mountains of economic reports and statistics, searching for the patterns behind the chaos. The guards there came to know him, the strange, tired man with a wild beard and ink-stained cuffs who arrived at opening and left only when the doors were locked. Sometimes he forgot to eat. Sometimes he forgot to speak. But in his silence, the world was speaking to him. Through every coin exchanged, every child sold into labor, every sigh of the city's tired lungs. The London rain became his metronome. It tapped softly on the window as he wrote. Night after night, weaving numbers into meaning, despair into theory. He was not simply studying economics. He was studying pain, the arithmetic of human suffering. And yet, through all of it, there was a tenderness to his struggle. He adored Jenny with quiet devotion. He would pause his work to hold her hand, to tell her stories of their early days in Trier, to remind her and himself that they were still more than their poverty. Sometimes, late at night, he would lift his youngest daughter, Eleanor, onto his lap and tell her stories about giants and kings, about a world where justice was not a dream. His voice, usually sharp and firm, softened like velvet. For a moment, he was not a revolutionary, just a father, tired and kind. Still, the years pressed down. His health began to falter. He coughed often, sometimes spitting blood. The doctors warned him to rest, but rest was a luxury he couldn't afford. Ideas were his only wealth now, and he spent them freely. Outside, London moved on indifferent, infinite. Inside, a man continued to fight his invisible war. The world had turned its back on him, yet he kept writing for a future that did not yet exist, for generations that might one day understand. And so, beneath the flicker of candlelight and the whisper of rain, the dream of Karl Marx endured, a dream not of vengeance, but of balance, of a world where no child would go hungry, no labor forgotten. The dream had cost him nearly everything, but still he wrote. And as another gray dawn broke over the rooftops of Soho, he dipped his pen into the ink once more, whispering to himself, "One day they will see." The years bled together in that dim London apartment, each one colder, poorer, and somehow lonelier than the last. Yet through it all, the steady rhythm of Karl Marx's pen never faltered. It scratched against the paper like the heartbeat of an idea that refused to die. The manuscript of Das Kapital grew heavier, its pages stained with ink, sweat, and grief. It was more than a book to him. It was a monument built out of pain. Every line carried the weight of the lives he had seen crushed beneath the wheels of industry. He wrote as if each word might free them, as if understanding could somehow undo suffering. Engels visited often, his presence a brief light in their dark world. He would bring food, letters, laughter, small reminders that friendship could survive even through ruin. Marx, stubborn as ever, would brush off his concern with a half-smile. When Das Kapital is finished, he said once, "Perhaps I will sleep," but sleep rarely came. The nights grew longer, filled with coughing fits that left him pale and trembling. Jenny sat beside him, reading passages aloud, her voice soft but steady. She had once been the daughter of privilege. Now she was the wife of a man the world had forgotten. And yet, she never spoke of regret. To her, their poverty was not shameful. It was proof of devotion to something larger than comfort. Marx's study had become a battlefield of paper. Stacks upon stacks of notes, letters, fragments of thought. On the floor, among old newspapers and tattered books, played little Eleanor, who would one day grow to carry her father's fire into her own time. She watched him work, her young eyes filled with quiet wonder. "Papa," she once asked, "why do you write so much?" He smiled faintly, lifting his gaze from the page. "Because the world is still asleep, my dear, and someone must try to wake it." Outside, London thundered with progress. Railways expanded. Factories multiplied. Fortunes were made overnight. The same system that fascinated Marx was also swallowing him whole. He studied it endlessly. The cycles of profit, the invisible chains of labor, the cruel poetry of a machine that devoured its makers. And in 1867, after more than 20 years of exile and toil, Das Kapital was finally published. The first volume appeared quietly, without fanfare. There were no crowds, no celebrations. Only a few scholars and radicals took notice. Most of Europe ignored it. A dense, difficult work by a man they thought long defeated. But history, like a seed, does not reveal its growth in a single season. When Marx held the printed copy for the first time, he ran his fingers along the cover as if it were a living thing. "It is done," he whispered to Jenny. "Or at least the beginning is." She smiled, though her face had grown thin, her hair touched with gray. "And was it worth it, Karl?" He hesitated. The question hung heavy between them. "Ask me when the world is different." They laughed softly, and for a moment, the darkness lifted. Yet the world did not change. Not immediately. Their poverty remained, their losses deepened. More of their children fell ill. One by one, they were buried in the cold English soil. Each grave left a silence that no philosophy could fill. Marx withdrew further into his work. He wrote letters to distant comrades, articles for obscure journals, and essays that few would ever read. His mind remained vast and brilliant, but his body was breaking. The years of deprivation had carved him hollow, and still, he refused to surrender. Sometimes, late at night, he would walk through the foggy streets alone. The gas lamps glowed faintly, their light barely cutting through the mist. He would stop near the Thames, watching the black water move beneath the bridges. The city hummed softly, a million souls dreaming, working, struggling. He felt them, unseen but near. He whispered into the fog, almost himself, "They do not know me, but I know them." It was in these quiet wanderings that the weight of his own life pressed hardest. He had wanted to be understood, but now he sensed that understanding would come too late, long after he was gone. Still, he took comfort in the thought that truth moves slowly, like water carving stone. Engels once told him, "You are too far ahead of your time, Karl. The world will need decades to catch up." Marx had smiled. "Then let the future be my audience." The years continued their slow, cruel march. Jenny's health declined, her body failing under the strain of years of sacrifice. In 1881, she passed away quietly in her sleep. Marx sat beside her bed for hours, holding her hand long after it had grown cold. When he finally spoke, his voice was a whisper. "You were my comrade in all things, even in the impossible." After her death, he was never the same. The fire dimmed, though it never went out completely. He still wrote, still thought, but each word carried the ache of absence. The house on Dean Street grew quieter. The laughter of his children had faded, replaced by the steady ticking of a clock and the occasional rustle of papers. Time was closing its hand around him, and yet, in his final letters, there was no bitterness, only reflection. "My life," he wrote, "has been nothing but struggle. Yet in struggle I found meaning. If there is any peace to be had, it is that my words may one day give voice to the voiceless." He knew, perhaps better than anyone, that the world forgets its prophets until the echoes return louder than before. And so, as winter settled once again over London, Karl Marx, tired, grieving but unbroken, sat by the window, watching the snow fall through the gaslight glow. Each flake drifted like a page from an unwritten chapter. He leaned back, eyes half closed, and whispered to the empty room, "Jenny, I hope they will understand us one day." The night answered only with silence. But somewhere, far beyond that silence, history was listening. The revolution that never came. By the time Karl Marx entered the twilight of his years, the fire of revolution, the same one that had once burned across Europe in 1848, had become a dim and distant memory. The barricade had fallen. The workers had returned to their machines, and the kings and bankers ruled again from their polished halls. And yet, beneath the quiet surface, something was stirring. The ideas that had once been mocked, banned, or ignored began to travel, like whispers carried on the wind. Das Kapital found its way into the hands of factory workers in Manchester, students in Paris, printers in New York, and young radicals across Russia. They read his words by candlelight, tracing each sentence as though discovering the map of their own suffering. Marx, frail but alert, watched this from afar with cautious hope. "It begins," he told Engels one evening, his voice raspy but steady. "The old world cracks not from thunder, but from within." Engels smiled wearily. Let's hope the new one knows how to stand. Their friendship had outlasted time, poverty, and distance. Engels, ever loyal, continued to support Marx's family, publishing his works, defending his name, and arguing tirelessly with critics who dismissed him as a dreamer. He was no dreamer, Engels once wrote. He was a man who refused to close his eyes. The world outside, however, moved at its own indifferent pace. Industrial cities grew monstrous. Smoke filled the skies, rivers turned black, and men, women, and children worked endless hours for meager coins. The very horrors Marx had warned were now the foundation of progress. And though his words were finally spreading, he was too ill to see the full awakening. He spent most days in his chair, wrapped in a heavy coat despite the fire burning in the grate. His daughters, Eleanor and Laura, took turns reading him letters from across the world, messages from unions, socialists, and philosophers who now called themselves his followers. In one letter, a young Russian wrote, "Your work has given us a language to speak our pain. We will carry it into the streets." Marx listened, a faint smile forming beneath his thick beard. "They speak of carrying it into the streets," he murmured. "But ideas are heavier than stones. Let's hope they are strong enough." Sometimes, when his illness allowed, he would dictate short notes, reflections, unfinished theories, fragments of thought that would later be gathered and published after his death. His mind remained sharp, his curiosity unbroken. He still believed that history itself was a living organism, growing, suffering, learning. And yet, he had begun to see the irony of his own life. "I have studied the liberation of mankind," he once told Eleanor, "and yet I could not free even myself from need." She touched his hand gently. "But your words will outlive every king, Papa." He laughed softly, though it turned quickly into a cough. "Then let's hope they outlive the landlords, too." The 1880s were cold years. Jenny was gone. Many of his friends had died or disappeared into the gray fog of history. Even his health, once stubborn, was failing fast. His lungs ached, his legs trembled, and his voice often broke mid-sentence. But he refused to rest. He spent his final months between London and the warmer climate of the South, where doctors hoped he might recover. He did not. In March of 1883, Karl Marx passed away quietly in his chair, surrounded by books, letters, and memories of battles never won. Engels, who had been his comrade for more than 40 years, was the one who closed his eyes for the last time. There were no grand funerals, no headlines, no state honors. Only a small group of mourners stood at his graveside in Highgate Cemetery, the cold wind cutting through the London air. Engels spoke briefly, his voice trembling but firm. His name will endure through the ages, and so will his work. Just as Darwin discovered the law of development in nature, Marx discovered the law of development in human history. And with that, they laid him to rest, a man who had died poor, misunderstood, and forgotten by the world he sought to awaken. But history, as he had always believed, is patient. In the decade that followed, his ideas began to bloom like seeds buried deep beneath the frost. Across continents, workers marched beneath red flags, shouting his name. Revolutions rose, some noble, others cruel, all claiming his vision as their own. By the early 20th century, Marx's words had become scripture for millions. Empires trembled, kings fled, and entire nations declared themselves for the workers. But whether they truly understood his dream, that was another story. For Marx had imagined not tyranny, but freedom, not dictatorship, but equality, a world where labor was not slavery, and humanity was not a commodity. Yet in the fires of revolution, that dream was often distorted. Still, the echo of his voice remained. More than a century after his death, in classrooms, protests, and debates, his name continues to stir emotion, anger, admiration, fear, and awe. He had wanted to be understood, and now the world could not stop speaking his language, even when it disagreed. Perhaps, somewhere beyond the reach of time, the spirit of Karl Marx smiles at the irony that the man who died penniless now lives eternally in the currency of ideas. He had written once, "Philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. And though the world is still changing, slowly, painfully, imperfectly, it has never stopped arguing with the ghost of Karl Marx." Years after Karl Marx's quiet burial in the fog of Highgate Cemetery, something extraordinary began to unfold. His words, once confined to dust-covered pamphlets and dimly lit study circles, started to move with a force that even he might never have imagined. They traveled along railways, across borders, through prisons and factories, a whisper that grew into a thunder. In Russia, the land of czars and peasants, that whisper became a roar. The writings of Marx, translated and passed hand to hand, lit a spark in minds suffocated by hunger and injustice. The young Vladimir Lenin, exiled and restless, read Das Kapital as a deciphering a sacred text. He saw in its pages not mere theory, but destiny. To him, Marx was not just a thinker. He was a prophet of the people's awakening. Lenin believed the time had come to turn philosophy into fire. And so, in the winter of 1917, as the world bled in the Great War, the Russian Empire cracked open from within. The red flags rose, the palaces fell, and the long night of monarchy gave way to the dawn of revolution. It was messy, brutal, uncertain, but for millions it felt like justice reborn. In Petrograd's frozen streets, workers shouted slogans they had learned from Marx's own pages. "Workers of the world, unite!" echoed across squares and factories, carried on the breath of people who had never met the man who wrote those words. And yet to them, he was there, not as a ghost, but as a guiding presence. But revolutions, like storms, do not always follow the map of their makers. What began as liberation soon turned to struggle for power. Lenin and his comrades tried to shape a new world out of chaos, a world where no man would own another's labor. Yet power has its own hunger, and slowly, inevitably, the revolution began to feed upon itself. Still, the idea endured. From Moscow to Berlin, from Shanghai to Havana, Marx's face appeared on banners and in classrooms, painted on walls and carved into statues. Some worshipped him as a saint. Others feared him as a ghost that haunted the old order. In Europe, governments trembled at the mention of his name. In America, his books were burned, banned, and whispered about in secret. It seemed the man who had died in silence had now become the loudest voice in the world. But what had he truly meant for humanity? He had never preached hatred, though his followers often fought with fury. He had not demanded blind obedience, though entire regimes claimed him as their god. His dream had been simple, almost fragile, that the dignity of work should belong to the worker, that human life should not be measured by profit. And yet, as revolutions turned red with blood, that fragile dream was reshaped by men far harsher than he. Marx's words, dissected, weaponized, glorified, became both the anthem of hope and the drumbeat of terror. Still, through it all, his philosophy persisted like a heartbeat beneath history's noise. In universities, young minds debated him late into the night. In factories, union leaders quoted his warnings about greed. In parliaments and protests, his ghost seemed to stand in the crowd, watching, listening, whispering reminders of a promise still unfulfilled. And somewhere in London, where the fog still rolls over Highgate Cemetery, his grave became a quiet pilgrimage. Flowers left by dreamers, by scholars, by those who still believe that the world could be rebuilt upon fairness and compassion. His stone bears only a simple line from his own work. Workers of all lands, unite. The words are weathered over time, softened by rain, kissed by moss, but they remain unbroken, just as the idea remains unbroken. As the 20th century marched forward, Marx's influence expanded into continents he had never seen: Asia, Africa, Latin America, where colonized nations found his writings a language of resistance. To them, Marxism was not a cold economic theory, but a call for dignity. In China, Mao Zedong would reinterpret Marx through the lens of peasant struggle, reshaping an empire into a revolutionary state. In Cuba, Fidel Castro would invoke Marx's legacy to ignite a flame of defiance against the powerful. Each time, his name was reborn in a new form, sometimes noble, sometimes monstrous, but always potent. The world was splitting between those who worshipped his vision and those who feared it. And through it all, history moved like a pendulum, swinging between hope and horror, between dreams of equality and the weight of control. Marx had given humanity the tools to question its chains, but he had not foreseen what new chains would rise in their place. Even so, the echo of his words lingered, gentle, defiant, eternal. He had written for the workers of the 19th century, but his message stretched far beyond his time. It reached into the present, into every person who ever looked at the world and whispered, "This cannot be all that we are meant for." And perhaps that is where his genius truly lies, not in systems or revolutions, but in that quiet moment when one human heart refuses to surrender to despair. Karl Marx did not live to see the world he dreamed of, but he left behind the courage to imagine it. And so, as night deepened over the bloody dawns of the 20th century, the red glow of his thought refused to fade. It flickered in every struggle for justice, in every demand for equality, in every small act of rebellion that began with the words, "We deserve better." The 20th century grew loud, filled with engines, cities, and restless ambition. And yet beneath all the noise, something ancient continued to whisper. It was the voice of a man who had died in obscurity, whose ink had dried before the world began to understand him. The voice of Karl Marx, still echoing like a quiet conscience within the machinery of progress. Factories had become faster. Workers were now parts of systems, their hands replaced by steel, their rhythms set by the pulse of machines. Capitalism, which Marx had studied like a living organism, had evolved, more powerful, more invisible, more global. It no longer lived just in factories and markets. It breathed through screens, satellites, and silent algorithms. And yet, as if by design, the pattern remained the same. A few grew richer. Many worked harder. And still, the question lingered: who owns the world, and who simply turns its gears? In the soft glow of modern cities, Marx's ghost seemed to walk unseen among the glass towers. He would have watched the traders on Wall Street, their eyes fixed on numbers, their hearts bound to markets that never sleep. He would have seen children in distant factories stitching clothes for nations they will never visit. He would have stood at the edge of it all, both awed and saddened, whispering, "I warned you." The irony was vast, almost poetic. The same forces he had condemned had now embraced his language. Corporations spoke of equality in advertisements. Governments promised dignity through profit. The word revolution became a slogan. And yet, beneath the glittering surface, the same human ache remained. In the silence of late nights, when cities slowed and the hum of traffic faded, the questions returned. What does progress mean if it leaves the soul behind? What is freedom if it depends on the cost of another's labor? Marx had once written that capitalism carried with it the seeds of its own destruction. He believed that exploitation would one day awaken its victims to rebellion. But instead, something stranger happened. The world learned to live with inequality, to decorate it, to disguise it behind comfort and convenience. Perhaps this was the cleverest evolution of all. Not to destroy rebellion, but to make it unnecessary. To make people forget what they had lost. And still in classrooms, in whispered conversations, in the quiet minds of dreamers, his words continue to breathe. From each according to his ability, to each according to his need. A sentence so simple, so human, that it felt almost like a prayer. Modern philosophers began to revisit him, not as a prophet of revolution, but as a poet of the human condition, a man who saw, before anyone else, how easily humanity could become machinery. They spoke of his work not as dogma, but as warning, not as blueprint, but as mirror, for even now, in an age of technology and wealth, people felt the same weight, the exhaustion, the distance, the quiet question of meaning. They worked, consumed, scrolled, and slept, and somewhere deep inside, a whisper asked, "Is this what it means to be free?" If Marx were alive today, perhaps he would sit in a small cafe, a cup of coffee cooling beside a flickering laptop, watching as people move through a world faster than they could feel. He would still be scribbling notes, not about coal and steel, but about data and desire. He would trace the same patterns in digital dust, seeing how capital had found new shapes, attention, influence, control. He might smile sadly at the irony that we are more connected than ever, yet lonelier than before, that machines built to serve now shape the way we think, that the worker's body may be free, but their mind still belongs to someone else. And in that recognition, the ghost of Marx would not rage, he would sigh, because he had always believed that history repeats, not as a perfect circle, but as an echo. The world keeps moving forward, yet somehow walks the same paths again. Still, he would not despair. For even in this restless modern age, there are moments when the human spirit refuses to be sold, when kindness defies competition, when people build not for profit, but for meaning. Marx would see that too, and perhaps it would make him smile again, because at its core, his vision was not about class or control, but about dignity, the belief that life is worth more than its price. And so, as the lights of modern cities shimmered like constellations of ambition, the ghost in the machine watched quietly, unseen, uncelebrated, but the world did not need to believe in Karl Marx to feel his presence. It moved through the streets, the markets, the lecture halls like a silent current, shaping thought in ways unseen yet undeniable. Artists painted it into their canvases. Philosophers wove it into their theories. Writers whispered it between the lines of novels. His ideas have become a lens through which humanity began to examine itself. In the quiet corners of universities, students debated him with fiery passion. Some loved him, some loathed him, and some merely feared the truth that his work reflected back at them. Marx had understood the machinery of human society, and even those who denied him could not escape the patterns he had revealed. Capitalism, the Industrial Revolution, technological progress, all were now measured against a mirror he had held up over a century earlier. Meanwhile, in the studios of modern artists, his shadow appeared in the shapes of their work. Painters depicted laborers with dignity. Sculptors immortalized anonymous hands that built monuments, and filmmakers told stories of struggle and resilience that echoed Marx's insistence on humanity's forgotten majority. Even in cinema, music, and literature, the ghost of his thought shaped the narratives of inequality, desire, and justice. Yet the world continued to twist and reshape his ideas. Governments borrowed his language without embracing his vision. Economists cited his analysis while ignoring his warnings. Activists invoked his name, sometimes with hope, sometimes with violence. He had written for clarity and justice, and the world responded in complexity and contradiction. Marx would have recognized the irony, and perhaps even smiled softly at it. Ideas, once freed, have a life of their own. They twist, adapt, and transform, never fully controllable by their creator. His writings, born from exile, poverty, and grief, have become a force more enduring than empires, more alive than any king or czar. Technology, the new pulse of civilization, carried his thoughts further than he could have imagined. Information flowed across continents, connecting workers and thinkers in ways Marx could never have foreseen. Social media, online movements, global protests, all reflected the enduring tension between power and the people, the very struggle he had sought to illuminate. In classrooms, students dissected his logic, debated his relevance, and questioned the application of his theories to a world of digital labor and automated economies. His words had become a foundation for inquiry, a spark for critical thought. Marx's influence now existed not merely in revolutions, but in the subtle shaping of consciousness itself, the way humanity considers fairness, freedom, and purpose. Artists continued to reflect the social undercurrents he had identified. Films portrayed the invisible hands that manipulate lives. Novels traced the quiet suffering of the overlooked, and music gave voice to the disenfranchised. Even those who had never read a single page of Das Kapital were touched by the themes he had brought to light: exploitation, alienation, and the yearning for dignity. And so, Marx lived in paradox. He was revered and reviled, understood and misunderstood, celebrated and ignored. His presence, like a gentle wind, moved through centuries, touching lives in subtle yet profound ways. For every person striving for justice, for equality, for meaning beyond material wealth, Marx's vision whispered softly in her ear, "The world can be different, if only we dare to imagine it." It was in this subtlety that his genius endured, not in the victories or defeats of empires, not in the triumphs of regimes or the failure of revolutions, but in the quiet, persistent shaping of thought. Even in modernity's chaos, his insight into human labor, ambition, and society remained a guidepost, a reminder that the soul of a world is measured not by its power, but by its compassion. And so, as cities rose taller, as machines grew smarter, and as society marched forward at an unrelenting pace, the ghost of Karl Marx moved silently among the people. He was in the books read at night, in whispered conversations about fairness, in the cautious hope of those who seek a better world. Though he had lived in exile, in poverty, and in grief, his legacy had become boundless. His vision had outlasted empires, survived revolutions, and now threaded itself through the fabric of global thought. In the hum of a factory, the click of a keyboard, the clamor of protest, his presence lingered, not as a ruler, not as a lawgiver, but as a quiet observer, a poet of society's hidden heart. And in that quiet observation, the final truth became clear. Ideas are eternal. Even when their creator sleeps beneath the earth, they can awaken, inspire, and endure beyond the measure of a single life. The ghost in the machine is not malevolent. It is patient. It is vigilant. It waits not to punish, but to remind us that history is alive, that the choices of the day echo through the lives of tomorrow, and that the dream of dignity and justice can never be silenced entirely. And so, as the hum of the modern world continues, Karl Marx whispers still, gently, persistently, and eternally, reminding humanity that the soul of the world is never truly lost, still present. He had once said, "The point is to change the world." But perhaps what he meant was simpler, to remind it of its soul. The story of Karl Marx does not end with his death, nor with revolutions that bore his name. It continues quietly, in the pulse of human thought, in the echoes of streets and classrooms, in the lingering questions of justice and freedom that hum beneath every era. Marx became more than a man. He became an idea, a shadow and a light entwined, shaping the world even in places he never touched. To trace his legacy is to follow a river that flows in many directions, sometimes turbulent, sometimes calm. It flows to the halls of academia, where scholars dissect his writings and argue over every common phrase, searching for meaning and guidance. It flows through art, where painters and writers capture the dignity and pain of those he sought to give voice. It flows through politics, both noble and corrupted, where leaders invoke his name for reasons he may never have intended. Even today, his words echo in the quiet corners of thought. The history of all hitherto existing society is a history of class struggles. That line, simple yet profound, resonates with anyone who has ever felt invisible, unheard, or oppressed. Across the globe, people recognize themselves in the struggle he described. The factory worker in Mumbai, the office clerk in Berlin, the student in Buenos Aires. In every city, in every language, his ideas endure. Yet his legacy is complex, full of contradictions, shadows, and unintended consequences. Revolutions inspired by philosophy brought hope to millions, but also fear, suffering, and repression. Systems built in his name sometimes betrayed his vision, wielding power in place of justice. Marx's dream of equality, so pure in the ink-stained pages of Das Kapital, was often reshaped by human ambition, human error, and human cruelty. Still, the essence of his work persists, a call to examine the structures that shape our lives, to question who profits and who suffers, to imagine a world in which humanity matters more than wealth. His writings act as a mirror, reflecting both the brilliance and the flaws of societies we inherit. They remind us that change is never simple, never instantaneous, but always possible. Artists, thinkers, and activists continue to grapple with his ideas. They reinterpret, argue, and innovate, weaving Marx's vision into new contexts. Feminism, environmentalism, digital economies. Each time, the ideas adapt, evolving as living entities do, proving that true insight cannot be confined to a single era. His words are no longer merely about coal and labor. They speak to the digital age, to global inequality, to the ways we measure human value in likes, clicks, and data. And yet, through all the reinterpretation, the human heart at the center of his philosophy remains clear. Marx cared not for ideology above life, but for life itself, the dignity of work, the freedom of thought, the potential for humanity to rise above exploitation. That core vision is what survives the chaos of history, guiding the curious and inspiring those who dream of a fairer world. In remembering Marx, we also remember the cost of his vision. He endured exile, poverty, illness, and grief. He buried children, watched his beloved Jenny die, and labored until his final breath. His life was a testament to dedication, a quiet rebellion against injustice in both thought and action. And though he could not see the full impact of his work, he planted seeds whose growth spanned centuries, continents, and ideologies. Today, when we reflect on Karl Marx, we are invited to look beyond the politics and the textbooks, to see the man who dreamed relentlessly, who wrote with both anger and tenderness, who never stopped asking the world to be better. He reminds us that ideas are powerful because they endure, they live in minds and hearts, shaping societies long after their authors are gone. And so, as night settles over the modern world, as cities pulse with electric light and machines hum softly in the background, his presence lingers, gentle yet persistent. In every debate about fairness, in every act of compassion, in every quiet dream of equality, the spirit of Karl Marx whispers still. He is the echo in the factory, the shadow in the city, the whisper in the library. He is a reminder that the struggle for dignity is timeless, that the human desire for justice cannot be extinguished, and that one man's vision, born of grief and hope, can ripple across centuries and continents. And perhaps, in that quiet persistence, lies the truest measure of his genius. Not in empires or revolutions, not in politics or ideology, but in the simple, enduring act of reminding humanity that it can be better, that the world can be changed, and that the dream of justice is never truly lost. And so, we arrive at the quiet culmination of Karl Marx's journey. A life carved from exile, ink, and unrelenting thought. He died surrounded by shadows of loss, yet his ideas, like seeds scattered in the wind, found fertile soil across the world. To look at his legacy is to see both light and shadow intertwined, a tapestry woven from triumph, tragedy, and timeless insight. Marx once wrote that philosophers had only interpreted the world. The point, he insisted, was to change it. And though he did not live to see revolutions succeed or empires fall, his words became a gentle compass, guiding generations toward understanding, questioning, and dreaming. He taught humanity to see beyond comfort and convenience, to look at who benefits, who suffers, and who is left invisible. Even in failure, his life was a lesson. He endured poverty that gnawed at his body, illness that whispered mortality, and grief that tore at his heart. Yet he never allowed despair to silence his voice. In every letter, in every article, in every line of Das Kapital, he left a piece of himself, a heartbeat pressed into paper, a truth quietly inscribed for future. History has not always been kind to Marx. His ideas have been misinterpreted, distorted, and wielded for power he never sought. Yet this, too, is part of the echo he left behind. The reminder that ideas are alive, untamed, and often larger than their creators. They carry the capacity to inspire, to challenge, and sometimes to wound. But within the chaos, there is beauty. For those who approach his work with curiosity and compassion, Marx offers clarity, a lens through which we can understand inequality, labor, and the structures that shape human life. He gives us language for injustice, a framework for hope, and a call to reflection. And perhaps the most enduring part of his legacy is not found in politics, economics, or revolutions. It is found in the quiet moments of thought, when a worker questions the value of their labor, when a student reads the world with new eyes, when a dreamer imagines a fairer, more compassionate society. In those moments, Marx lives, not as a man of history, but as a whisper in the mind, a subtle reminder of humanity's potential. He reminds us that change does not arrive with thunder alone. It often begins in whispers, in the steady accumulation of understanding, in the patient conviction that injustice need not be permanent. And even when the world fails to hear, even when greed and power claim victory, the dream of dignity persists, like embers beneath ashes, waiting for a breath of courage to spark them anew. To reflect on Marx's life is to embrace contradiction. A man who witnessed suffering and yet produced hope. A philosopher whose work inspired both liberation and oppression. A thinker exiled and impoverished, whose ideas would one day circulate more widely than the nations he had known. His story is neither perfect nor linear, but it is human, raw, persistent, and profoundly instructive. In the stillness of night, when the hum of modern life quiets and the mind drifts into reflection, his presence can be felt. In the laborer who pauses to wonder why the hours pass so relentlessly. In the student who reads deeply and questions what has been taken for granted. In the dreamer who dares to imagine fairness and equality. There, quietly, is Marx. And so, as this general reflection comes to a close, we can lay aside the weight of politics and ideology and simply behold the life of a man who dared to see the world differently. A man who endured exile, poverty, grief, and loss, yet never lost his vision. A man who reminded humanity that the value of life is not measured in coins or titles, but in compassion, dignity, and understanding. If these words carry you close to sleep, let this channel stay by your side too, as a quiet companion through history's long nights. Let the echoes of Karl Marx remind you that ideas are eternal, that hope persists in even the darkest times, and that one life, lived with purpose and reflection, can ripple across centuries in ways that no empire, no fortune, and no passing moment can erase. And as the night stretches softly around you, imagine Marx walking silently through the fog of London, ink-stained hands holding a vision of a world that could be better, whispering to those who would listen, do not forget, struggle, dream. The world can still be changed. And with that, we close the story of Karl Marx, a life tragic and luminous, exiled and eternal, a man whose voice, though hushed in his own time, continues to ripple through history, calling humanity to reflection, courage, and hope.